Greetings, class. Today we're going to talk about synagogues, past and not quite present, for some minor family health reasons. I've had to spend the day attending my children. And so I think, well, what I've decided to do so that I could get this lecture up at a reasonable time for you to have enough time to view it before our class on Monday. I'm posting it tonight. And then in our class on Monday, we will look at some examples of contemporary synagogues. So this is the past. In the future, it'll be the present. And I don't know. There should be some Back to the Future reference in there, but I'll leave that to you. So we're going to start in the ancient world, and actually, I wanted to just reiterate a couple of things about temple worship, and highlight some things that I think weren't mentioned in the previous lecture about temples in the ancient world. And we do know some things about what tabernacle and temple worship would have looked like that we can gather from a variety of texts. Obviously, the text of the Hebrew Bible, also the some New Testament texts give an image, but obviously, that's a distinct context, right? So we know that there were sacrifices that would happen on a daily basis in the temple. Animal sacrifices, not exclusively, but animal sacrifices would happen in the Holy of Holies and would be performed by priests. And there's various types of sacrifices. So a holocaust or a burnt offering of an entire animal, for example, offerings that only the priest partook of, offerings that were shared with the entire community, and offerings, sacrifices that weren't just animals, but also grains, the burning of incense. You might think of the Psalms, and actually in terms of the text that would be used in the temple, the Psalms were one of the primary texts and would be sung or chanted. We also have records of priestly benedictions or blessings, and there were 24 categories of priests, so different, and here I'm speaking about temple, right? So up until 70 CE when the temple was destroyed. The rest of our class will be focusing on the shift to an emphasis on the synagogue and the community life there. The book of Leviticus, for example, records baking, displaying, and eating of the showbread. And we also know, because there was one temple, right, that people who lived in other regions, there were synagogues that already existed before the destruction of the temple. Those people who did not live in the vicinity of the temple could go on pilgrimage for special festivals and liturgical periods, for example, Passover, the Feast of Booths, things like that. People who lived far away could also pay a special tax to have a sacrifice done on, or like a fee, to have sacrifices done on their behalf. So the period that we're going to be focusing on, actually for a lot of this lecture, is what's known as the Rabbinic period, and that's roughly 70 CE to 700 CE. And also a quick note about the diaspora. So with the pay no attention there, I thought maybe I'd given myself a map. That with the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, Jews began migrating and dispersing to other parts of the Roman Empire. So there are many kinds of groups of Jews that are self-identified throughout the world, but a few, just to name a few main categories, and maybe you've heard some of these names. So one of the oldest is what's known as the Mizrahim, and these are Jews. This comes from the a Hebrew word for east. And they're Jews who descended from Jewish communities in the Middle East and Central Asia. Um, and uh, and well, I could use it as a segue into talking about Sephardic Jews, because Mizrahim Jews, because they're coming from Middle East and Central Asia, do sometimes end up in North Africa. And so Sephardic Jews um, are, the word Sephardic or Sephardim comes from the Hebrew word for Spain. Um, so uh, Jews have been in Spain for a long time, even before the Roman Empire, kind of according to tradition. Um, we do know that they're in Europe and specifically Spain by the first century CE. So it may be that they were there much earlier. Um, and we know that they were in Spain by the fourth century CE for certain, because there's a council forbidding certain activities by the Jews. Obviously a Christian council. Um, for example, prohibiting that Jews and non-Jews eat together. So, and then one of the other main Jewish groups in Europe is Ashkenazi, or Ashkenaz. And these are Jews that are, it comes from a word that actually existed a long time before Germany, but came to be applied to the region of Germany and Northern Europe. So the term Ashkenaz, which, like I said, had actually shows up in the Hebrew Bible, was applied to Jews living in northern France and in Western Germany in the Middle Ages. Okay. And also, if you're studying manuscripts, these are categories that are used in talking about medieval and early modern Jewish manuscripts, just as a side note. Okay, so we'll come back to talking about the Jewish diaspora a little bit later in the lecture, but for now we're going to focus on the architecture, and before we get to that, what worship would look like in the early synagogue. So, as I said, synagogues existed before the destruction of the temple. They may have been founded during the Babylonian exile or Second Temple period. We know that there are, at least over 100 founded by the destruction of the temple. So the word synagogue, as we use it, is actually a Greek word that's been incorporated into English, which is a Greek word for assembly. There are lots of other words in Hebrew, in Yiddish, for example. In Yiddish, it's shul or school, but there's Sephardic Jews will have one term for it, or kind of like a common term, and so on. Ashkenazi Jews would have another. Well, Ashkenazi Jews are the ones who have shul or school. I mentioned Yiddish, but so we can use the word synagogue since we're in an English context, of course. But the synagogue is a place of assembly, even before the destruction of the temple. It's a place for study, for perhaps even prayer before the destruction of the temple, but not a place of sacrifice. Sacrifice only happens at the temple. And it's a place where, as you see in the third bullet point there, academic study is happening, particularly of the men in, particularly / exclusively of the men in the community at this time in history. That's no longer the case, of course. And leadership shifts from, priests in the temple context to rabbis in the synagogue context, and also the cantor who would lead in communal singing or chant. The Mishnah also, so and I should say, um, the the sorry, I'm losing my spot here. The um, Mishnah expands upon the Torah, and expands upon it in a way that, the Torah makes maybe kind of like declarations that are not very detailed, right? Difficult to follow. So the Mishnah is an elaboration on this, and gives more specific instructions. And so it's one place where we find instructions for what worship, or what prayer should look like in the synagogue. So that's why the Mishnah is, well, one of the reasons why the Mishnah is important. And in the 5th and 6th century, it becomes part of the Talmud. Um, so the synagogue is communal. So what takes place in the synagogue needs to have a quorum of at least 10 men to proceed. Um, and there is obviously liturgical elements. There are liturgies, so there are specialized prayers and so on. So for example, the Shema is recited twice a day, which is an affirmation of Judaism. So it's a kind of declaration of faith, the first line of which is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." Um, and that might remind you of, is it the Bismillah in Islam? So the Shema is recited twice a day, followed by a Barakot, which is blessings, um, and the Decalogue, which is the Ten Commandments, right? And then recitations of different types of prayer. So tefillah is kind of generally prayer. Amida is standing prayer. And the barakot, like I said, is blessings. So there are kind of different categories of prayers that are being recited. Also, a priestly blessing, um, reading of the Torah as you would expect. We see that recorded there, that the Torah is being read in New Testament documents, like I said, where we see descriptions of, in the early Jewish and Christian community, of what's happening in the temple and in the synagogue. Reading from the prophets, and then, as I mentioned, also the Psalms, which is a whole, several of these things are being carried over from the temple practice, right? Not the sacrifice, though. Later synagogue worship, liturgy, incorporates, and maybe, not simplifies is the right word, but retains some of these aspects, and solidifies what, is still, much of what is still done today in many communities. So a daily service, a Shabbat service. There's also liturgical texts that are being used, the order of service. The Shema, as I mentioned just a moment ago, these different categories of prayers, scripture readings. The Haftorah is just a short reading from the prophets that follows the reading from the law. And then exposition of scripture, so a kind of teaching. And these elements will be important, specifically the reading of scripture and the teaching on scripture. We'll see will have will necessitate architectural elements, right? Certain architectural elements. And then mourner's prayer, closing prayer. It's also, oh, and I should say before I go to the next slide, on the right-hand side here, we see just a fragment of a glass bowl from the 4th century CE that has an ark here, and the 2 menorah flanking this, and then the shofar. So in other words, there are liturgical elements from the temple, which at this point had been destroyed for, 200 to 300 years, are still being represented. And this inscription is kind of too fragmented to really translate. You can see it's in Latin, but drink with something or other. Okay, also important to note, and this is the case with, all of the religious communities we're going to be looking at. Well, I shouldn't say all of them, but with many of the religious communities we're looking at this semester, um, there's the kind of like public communal practice, which has one architectural, or at least one architectural context, and then personal practices, right? Which is in a different space, often a domestic space or maybe outdoors. So in the Jewish community, that looks like prayers before and after meals, various dietary observances, yep, based on the time of year, um, uh, ritual purity elements like the mikvah, this ritual cleansing, which would be done after, sex, menstruation, childbirth, preparation for burial, so on. Circumcision on the 8th day after a child is born. Um, and then, for example, end of life. So both sides here. End of life, sitting shiva, which is mourning in community for 7 days after a death. This is not an exhaustive list. I mean, so it's just an example. Again, I have a 4th century image here on the right hand side. This is a little terracotta lamp that has a menorah on it, and it's a 7-branched menorah, which is what was in the temple. And following the destruction of the temple, menorahs were not created with 7 branches. They would be with maybe 9 for Hanukkah or 6. But the practice was um, that you're not to make a liturgical element to replace or imitate what was in the temple, right? So no 7-branched candelabra for that reason. Okay, so let's move towards architecture. Like I mentioned, the Mishnah gives some guidance about elements of synagogue architecture. Um, we also get, I think it's Maimonides in the 12th century, who also uh, gives some instructions about architectural design, but maybe I'm crossing my streams there. So a few things. Ideally, the axis of the structure would be oriented towards Jerusalem. We see divisions of space, thinking back to um, the tabernacle and the temple before the synagogue, meaning, kind of exterior and interior, also division within the space itself, usually by men and women, in which the main space was for um, men, often exclusively, and there was separate space for women. These are things that are not retained in the modern era, um, probably with the exception of Orthodox Jewish communities. But um, at the period we're talking about for this lecture, which is late antique and medieval, basically, that would be the case. The most important architectural element of a synagogue would be the Torah niche, or the Torah ark, and this is where the Torah, that is the scroll of the first 5 books, would be kept. And it is analogous to the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, right? In the temple. So the storing of the Torah is very important, and the reading of the Torah is very important. And so there would be a raised platform called a bima, and this element just kind of pointing forward to 2 weeks from now when we're talking about Christian architecture. The bima will be also incorporated into Christian architecture. So the bima is a platform, and this is also an element, I should say, that already existed in Greek architecture, or maybe not already, but also existed in Greek contexts for an orator to stand on, right? It's a functional, it raises a speaker or a reader up in a crowd. So there's acoustic benefits, there's visual benefits, and then there's kind of like symbolic or ideological benefits by raising up the person who's reading the sacred text, where everybody can see them, right? So the platform is the thing that you're standing on. There's also a pulpit uh, from which one could teach, and or a reader's desk where the scroll would be laid out. Here, this image is a little difficult to see. This is one of the oldest surviving scrolls that's Torahs that's still in use, and you can see the pointer here because because the text is sacred. So you're not going to get all up in there with your greasy hands, but to follow along in the text, you'll use a pointer, which are often really ornate and beautiful. And you're also not, because reading scripture is important and you need to read it correctly. There would be, and still is today, when somebody's reading from the Torah, um, elders around the table to make sure that the person reading is doing so correctly, and they will correct them if they make a mistake in their reading. Okay, so and then there's also remainders or reminders, really, because it's not the actual temple implements, but reminders of them. So, for example, the Ner Tamid, which is a lamp that is hung above the Torah niche. I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between past and present because some of these elements are retained um, in modern synagogues. But um, so this lamp that's hung above uh, the Torah niche or the Torah ark is associated with the menorah, associated with the incense of the temple, and the phrase means eternal light, or kind of like unending light, or this light that doesn't go out, right? Okay. So we have these, even after the destruction of the temple, explicit and implicit references to the instruments of the temple, the liturgy of the temple, and even the kind of organization of space in the temple is retained in some way. And the temple continues to be literally a kind of really important aspect of the Jewish religious imagination, really forever, right? But one early example of that, so this is, what is that, 60 years after the just, nope. Yeah, 60 years after the destruction of the temple. This is a coin that's dating to that dates to the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is called such because it was a revolt led by Simon Bar Kokhba against the Roman Empire from 132 to 135 CE. These coins were issued during that time, and they were actually issued from existing Roman coins and other foreign coins, in which they would file down the Roman, design and then imprint them, basically. So here's with an image of the temple on the left-hand side there, and you can see the Ark of the, I think this is meant to represent the Ark of the Covenant there. But it's also visible in a lot of other things, or referenced in many other things. So here's a little bit later, a 4th century catacomb, Jewish catacombs in Rome, technically outside the city walls, where we see menorah flanking this ark, basically, right? Or in the Bet Alpha synagogue in Byzantium, the 6th century, we have and I apologize for the quality of the image. So on the left-hand side, you have a model of this, which is kind of fun for scale. But on the right-hand side, the actual image of the mosaic located in the ruins. And these floor mosaics with zodiacs are interesting. There's more than 20 of these that survive in late antique synagogues. And they were also found in some Christian contexts, although they weren't as popular. They weren't retained into the Middle Ages in Christian contexts in the way that they were in Jewish ones. And they also appear in Jewish manuscripts sometimes. Now, I should say, zodiac appears in Christian manuscripts as well, and Christian theologians were very interested in the zodiac and astronomy and things like that, right? And the calendars and all kinds of things. Okay, I'm not going to go down that rabbit trail, but at the top register, that is the register that's closest to what was the Torah niche, we see again 2 candelabra here, an ark there, and then some little animal guys hanging out. Down here we have what looks to be the sacrifice of Isaac, or really the almost sacrifice of Isaac. You can see that there's text in both Greek and in Hebrew, so that kind of multilingual, intercultural kind of context, right? There are some where, and actually maybe it's, yeah, it's this one at the center where Helios is depicted at the center of the zodiac. That's interesting too, because in early Christian catacomb, there's an image of Jesus depicted as Helios, right? So you have this kind of syncretism is not quite the right word, but so but the persistence of the temple, its association with, of course, the Ark of the Covenant, which was kept there, also the Ark of the Torah in the synagogue architecture. So now I'd like us to go to Syria and look at one of the earliest, not the earliest, but one of the earliest synagogues that we have. And apologies to those of you who were in my art history class recently, because you're familiar with this, so you can use this a moment to quiz yourself, I guess, maybe. But it's a site that's important, so I can't not talk about it when we're talking about synagogues in the ancient world. So Dura Europos was a frontier city and basically a Roman outpost in the Roman Empire. It's on the border of modern day Syria and Iraq, and I'll show you a map here in a second. But this is in the bottom left here is, I'm pretty sure that this is actually from the synagogue. And you can see the figures walking here to give you a sense of scale. So this site, these ruins, were discovered by British soldiers in 1920, who, in kind of immediately post World War I, and they immediately they stumbled upon the walls of this pagan temple, and immediately recognized, of course, the ancient site and its potential significance. And so archaeologists were called in, and there's this major dig that lasted, well over a decade. Archaeologists from Yale, archaeologists from France. A lot of the site is actually still, a lot of the materials from the site are still at Yale University, displayed in the Yale University Art Gallery currently. Very Indiana Jones. I'm sure there's a lot more in boxes in a big warehouse. But this included, the synagogue is a really important discovery for this, which we'll turn to in a second, because art historians largely considered in the 20th century, when this was discovered, largely considered the Jews and Christians of the 2nd and 3rd centuries to be aniconic, resistant to images. And this discovery proved that that was not the case. So here's where we're hanging out, really on the border of the Roman Empire at the time, and the Persian or Sasanian Empire. And it was a strategic location. It was originally a city that had been founded by the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire in the 3rd century BCE, but then about 500 years after its founding, that is in the 2nd century CE, it was captured and turned into a Roman military base. So it's this frontier city. It's the last, the last city in the Roman Empire. I was just watching Star Wars earlier tonight with my children, and that's thinking about outposts and, I don't know, Tatooine or something like that. Anyway, so it was originally just called Europos. Dura, the word fortress, was added later. And as a, well, you can see it's a military base, right? It's at a strategic location. It has the Euphrates River along one side, and it basically is surrounded by bluffs. And so it just necessitated one defensive wall. The necropolis is outside of the city, as you would expect in the Roman context, and in any kind of ancient city, I suppose. And you can see this kind of chaotic labels here, that there are various temples. There's the usual, kind of baths and amphitheaters and things that you would expect in a Roman city. But it's interesting because there's numerous temples to Zeus and other Greek deities, to Eastern deities, including so the Mithraeum down here is the uh, building for the cult of Mithras, which is a Persian religion or Eastern religion. Um, and there are, of course, private homes, public baths, amphitheaters. I already said that. Forums, right? Um, what happened is that in the year 250 CE, the Persians attacked the Western Wall, and their slaves were the ones who did it, I guess. And we found the archaeologists, discovered these poor souls um, buried underneath these walls. So their tactic was to dig underneath the wall to make it collapse so that they could rush into the city. When the townspeople realized this, it seems that they began to gather, detritus and dirt, and even dismantling um, their own city to fortify that wall. um, and in fact, for us historians, that's a good thing because it preserved the structures that were along that western wall, which included a Christian house church, which we'll return to in a couple of weeks, the Mithraeum, which I mentioned, and then the synagogue, which we're going to turn to now. The synagogue was not discovered by archaeologists until um, the early 1930s, so about a decade after the site was discovered. And we're flipped now from that previous map. So the Western Wall is here, the Euphrates runs along on the east. And we're going to look at the synagogue, which dates to the second half of the second century. Um, so it's a relatively large complex that you can see here. So they're not having to be in hiding. They're living relatively peaceably in a Roman context. Um, the room we're going to focus on is this room of assembly, and we'll turn there now. This is a recreation of the room, which is at Yeshiva University in New York. Just FYI. But obviously, the big thing to note is there are floor to ceiling images, and this was quite staggering. The images date to roughly 240 CE, is estimated by scholars. But you can see here along the line, this kind of jagged line of where the walls would have been reinforced and what preserved the images there. So we have three main registers that survive. A register along the bottom, which has these kind of animal and decorative features. For the sake of time, we're gonna look at really just the Torah niche and then one other image. And I apologize for how crappy this image is. So this is facing west to Jerusalem, as we would expect. So with the destruction of the temple, the study of the Torah really replaces or comes to replace animal sacrifice. Like, study of the Torah is already important, right? But the emphasis rather shifts. And we see that reflected in that this is, and you can maybe bounce back here, this kind of scallop shell here. So the Torah would be stored there. Directly above the Torah then is a depiction of the temple. And that little feature in the kind of like tympanum or lunette shaped feature there with the same scallop pattern, I think really subtly but successfully associates the Torah with the temple, right? And then on the left-hand side, we have the menorah depicted, other liturgical elements here, tools. And then on the right-hand side, a depiction of the sacrifice of Isaac. So here's Abraham with his back to the viewer, a knife here. His son Isaac is on the top of a altar. Probably his wife Sarah here in the tent. And then the hand of God is interceding to stop Abraham from sacrificing Isaac. And instead, God, according to the story, provides a ram, which is caught in this bush for Abraham to sacrifice instead. So it's a story of covenant and God fulfilling a promise, next to an image of the temple, which is um, also important to note that, the community that created this image had never seen the temple, right? They're living in diaspora, they're living in a kind of exile, um, and but it still is obviously really essential to um, their their community, to their tradition, to their understanding of the divine, and is associated with the study of the Torah. One more image, just really briefly, in the same room. We have an image of Moses. This is kind of a before and after, like a real crazy before and after. So Moses is doubly depicted with his staff, note dressed as a Roman, and the hand of God also doubly depicted. So we have Pharaoh's army here on the left hand side, little foreshadowing maybe with the wonderful lively fish flopping around there. Um, Maybe city walls in the background. And then on the right hand side, Pharaoh's army drowning in the Red Sea. Fish still very flippity floppity there. And again, depicted over the temple. So, promise, fulfillment associated with the temple. So, this kind of um, I don't know, emphasis on covenant, emphasis on God fulfilling God's promises. There probably would have been also a mosaic pavement, likely in the synagogue here. Okay. I want to say really briefly a couple of things about the context of um, the Jews in Europe. So, there are many remains of, and we'll read about this in the Stephen Fine article, so I'm not going to belabor that very much. But there are ruins of early uh, synagogues in the ancient world, including that at Dura Europos. Um, the Jews had been in Europe anywhere from the 4th century BCE to the 5th century CE, initially under Greek rule, then under Roman rule. Um, they, um, after the destruction of the temple, like I said, they immigrate to other European lands. Some of them were taken as slaves to Rome. Some of them immigrated to Spain, so as I mentioned, the Sephardic Jews, others to Northern Europe, described as the Ashkenazi or Ashkenazim Jews. So worship shifts during this time from the temple to the synagogue to rabbinical authority. In other texts besides the New Testament texts, also we have accounts from this from Philo of Alexandria in the 2nd century and Josephus, who are two Jewish authors that give us a sense of what that period was like. After the fall, so-called fall of the Roman Empire in the late 5th century, Rome was under the rule of the Visigoths, and this is the case into the 6th century, in which the Franks, and then this becomes the Carolingians, regain control. Or, I mean, maybe just gain control. I shouldn't say regain control, but gain control, and of that part of the Roman Empire, right? And then in the year 800, Charlemagne is crowned the first Holy Roman Empire in a few hundred years. During this time, the Jews lived in relative, I say relative peace, depending on the ruler, of course, right? So under the Visigoths, they lived in relative peace. Actually, Charlemagne's father and Charlemagne himself both aimed to, I think, kind of protect Jewish communities in Europe, especially in southern France. There was an established Jewish community. Charlemagne had at least one Jewish advisor in his court, but but really it's with the Crusades that uh, anti-Jewish violence begins to escalate in Europe. Um, so we could say it's kind of, they're the Jewish community is not, um, it's not like they were especially welcomed or incorporated before that. Um, but they were, say, valued, I mean, because they were highly literate and much more literate than many Catholic communities, because of the role of the Torah and Torah study and so on, as I've talked about, right? So that made them very truly like useful in terms of like using their literacy in business, and so on, right? So they were valued and incorporated and used by Christian leadership and so on, right? And so, uh, but with with the Crusades, which began in 1095, in which Pope Urban II, well, he preached a sermon that kind of began this wave of campaigns trying to regain the Holy Land from Muslim control. Um, and yeah, we'll discuss in a couple of weeks Islamic architecture and mosques in particular. So we haven't quite gotten to the period in history. I mean, we're focusing on religious communities individually, right? But in the 7th century, with the advent of Islam, and when the Arabic armies are taking over aspects of Byzantium, which had been under Christian rule, the Jews have a much better time under Islamic rule than they did under Christian rule, because they're respected as fellow monotheists. They generally just have to pay some special taxes, but are able to live in more or less harmony without the kind of persecution that they experienced under the Christian West. That's just a side note. Um, the Fourth Lateran Council is another touch point. I'm sorry, regarding the Fourth Crusade. So not only are Christian crusaders trying to retake the Holy Land and occupy it, but they're also on, the crusaders are often on their way to the Holy Land, um, doing violence even within Europe. So, sometimes against Jews, right? So the shortly thereafter, and actually, because there's subsequent crusades in 1240 and 1248, 1270, 1290, and then it kind of putters out. So in 1215, still in the midst of this, is the Fourth Lateran Council, which has issues several canons that target Jews. So, for example, Canon 67 said that that Jews should basically make tithes and offerings to churches. Um, um, well, I don't totally quite get that one, because it's like when Christians have lost property to Jews, that they need to, like, the Jews need to tithe to pay to make up for that. I don't know. I need to go back and read that one. The big one is Canon 68, in which both Jews and Muslims of any and all sexes, um, in every Christian province, need to distinguish themselves by dress. So it's not to the point of the Star of David, but obviously this is the beginning of that. This is one of the earliest iterations of that. Actually, they would wear badges of the tablets of the law. Jews did, that is. There's also hats that they, a pointed skull cap that they initially wore, Jewish men initially wore voluntarily, and then were forced to wear as part of this. And there's a couple of other canons as well. Estimating, population in the pre-modern era is always a little difficult. But we can estimate that in the 14th century, there were about 2.5 million Jews living in Europe. About a third of them lived in Spain, which brings us to the Spanish Inquisition. Drink water. Okay, I'm back. So the Spanish Inquisition is a whole, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, right? Still something I don't fully follow all the ins and outs of. But as you probably know, the Inquisition was a Catholic tribunal trying to kind of root out and punish heresy. And it became increasingly violent. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Heresy. Oh, I don't know. So it began in 1233. It was then really targeting a particular religious sect in France called the Albigensians. And then by 1255, it was spread throughout really Central and Western Europe. It was not instituted in Scandinavia or in England, actually, though. So what would happen is that, there would be a tribunal set up in a location, in a town, and there'd be like an open call, come and confess your heresies or something like that. And then if people didn't come then the tribunal officers would start accusing people, and then they would begin this trial period, which included, imprisonment and torture. And even people who confessed sometimes had their property taken from them. In the beginning, it was focused on Christian heretics, but in time, it came to target the Jews as well, and was very paranoid about Jews who had converted to Christianity and then were like secretly still practicing Judaism, was one target. They burned in the mid 13th century, condemned the Talmud, and burned just thousands of books. In the late 13th century, 1288, there was the first mass burning of Jews in France. The Inquisition begins in France, or not in France, excuse me, in Spain, in the late 15th century. And this is where I spoke a little too soon. And this is where it was over called conversos, or secret Jews, that is, Jewish converts to Christianity, or who were allegedly still practicing Judaism. Anybody who had close relationships to the Jewish community were accused of being secretly Jewish. So I'm not going to go into really any further into that horrific history, but to say that to note that all of these things. Oh, and I didn't mention the plague. Sorry. The plague too in 1348. Well, there's not just one plague. There are many plagues in European history, but in 1348 to 1350, what we know is the bubonic plague, the Black Death, the Black Plague, so on, many names, that really much more than decimated European population, like maybe, at least a third of European people died. It was also a period of increased persecution of the Jews. They were often accused of poisoning wells and things like that, and so there were some mass kind of persecution excuse me, persecution and murder of Jews during and after the plague. And then the expulsion from Spain comes of the Jews and Muslims in 1492, is related to the Inquisition and this kind of like rooting non-Christians out. But I bring these things up. One, of course, it's a devastating part of European history, but it has an impact on the history of synagogues and Jewish architecture. We have the same issue in the study of Jewish art and manuscripts, and that there really isn't, compared to the thousands of manuscripts, thousands of Christian manuscripts that survive from the Middle Ages. We have a relatively, I'm sorry, I don't have a specific number, but a much smaller number of Jewish manuscripts, exactly because they were burned by the hundreds and by the thousands by the by European Christians, by the church. And so similarly, we don't have, there are medieval churches still, right, that survive throughout Europe. There's all the major ones, but there's many, many that you can just find in tiny villages and so on, right? That's not the case with synagogues. The population was smaller, but they were also consistently persecuted and expelled from different communities. And so they don't, we don't have that history preserved in architecture. So before we look at one example, though, of a synagogue that does survive, just one example of that, the persecution, and in fact related to the plague, in the city of Colmar, which is in modern day France. Shortly before the plague struck in the mid 14th century, a community of Jewish citizens had immigrated, which is part of the Holy Roman Empire at that time, and were more or less, incorporated into the community. Were flourishing. They were merchants. There was a wine industry. The Jewish community built a synagogue. There was a mikveh for bathing, ritual bathing. There was a school. But very, really, immediately with the plagues striking in the mid 14th century, the townspeople began accusing the Jews there of poisoning the wells. And actually, the Pope at the time attempted to defend the Jews, and we have letters, not just from the Pope, but from other local officials, trying to convince people, not to be violent, not to be, they don't use the words irrational, but right, to say like, there are people dying in these other places where there's no Jews. Like, it can't be the Jews poisoning the wells everywhere. Like, trying to kind of reason with people and convince them. And even the, emperor tried to intercede, but unfortunately, and really, it's beyond tragic. The citizens of Colmar, the residents of Colmar, burned their Jewish citizens to death. Yeah, it was a massacre. And what we're looking on the right-hand side is a ring from what is known as the Colmar treasure, which was a treasure of several, many beautiful rings and gold pieces. Sorry, not dishes, but like chalices and things like this, that were buried, were hidden in this building. So likely by, a family who knew this persecution was happening, hid their materials with the hope that they could, their treasure, with the hope that they could come back and find it. And it was only discovered, centuries later. I think in the early 20th century, actually. And there's a few of these treasures, or hoards, as they're called sometimes, that seem to be, and some of them are, if they didn't have Hebrew inscriptions, we wouldn't necessarily know that they were owned by a Jewish person. So this is one example on the right-hand side. It's a ceremonial wedding ring. really beautiful. It has this little, and I'm showing you because this architectural element, right, um, I think is a reference to not just me. I mean, scholars think that these rounded arches and so on, this architectural form, the dome, is a reference to the lost temple, right, in Jerusalem. But it's a wedding ring, so it's then by depicting or referencing the temple architecture on a wedding ring, you're connecting your home as newlyweds to the temple. Um, Also on the top, where you can see are some of the Hebrew letters that spell Mazel Tov, good luck, um, very hopeful, um, and sad in the way that it was found. um, okay, and now we can move from, this powerful imagined uh, architectural elements to this synagogue that survives. Before I get to that, specifically, just a couple of like kind of general notes about synagogues in medieval Europe. Um, so there aren't, well, in Jewish communities in medieval Europe too. So despite this, terrible these canons and so on against the Jews and some of the other persecutions, there weren't walled ghettos in Europe until the 16th century on, and not, you know, everywhere, right? But so that's a little bit of a later development, just a side note. So we're going to remember that a synagogue's central axis would be ideally facing Jerusalem. In the case of Prague, where we're now going, that would be to the southeast of the city. And the focal point within a synagogue will be the Torah ark. Um, and so when a Torah would be removed, the scroll of the Torah would be removed from the ark. It would be processed to the center of the synagogue, where it would go, uh, where the people carrying it would bring it up onto the bima, that platform, and then put the scrolls on a reading table. And then different people from the community would read with that accountability and with the pointer, right? So I should say what we're looking here. So this is the synagogue that's known as the Altenus School. Altenus Shul literally means the old new synagogue, because the city later built a new synagogue. So it's the old new synagogue, which is fun. And so its name is in Yiddish. It's known by its name in Yiddish, which is a language that's kind of based on Middle High German, right, and spoken by European Jews. Not exclusively European Jews, but it's where the context that it emerged from. So you can see now on the floor plan, it began as a small rectangular building that was likely in the 13th century, and then it was enlarged in the 13th century, enlarged in the 14th century, and the 15th century, and then even the 18th. But we're going to focus on the medieval part. And it was actually probably designed and built, those expansions were probably designed and built by Christians, actually, because Jews were excluded from building trades. And we haven't gotten to Christian architecture yet, so you maybe won't note this, but you can keep this in mind next week or in 2 weeks when we look at early Christian architecture. This is clearly not the floor plan of a church, right? It has a different liturgical function, and the space reflects that. It's interesting, though, because the interior is in a Gothic style. So we'll also talk about Gothic architecture in a couple of weeks. But among other things, Gothic architecture is characterized by the pointed arch, which allows for higher, thinner walls. This ribbed groin vault here, which offers like a support, it's kind of like an exoskeletal system. and stained glass windows, which are not present here. This building has pretty small windows, which maybe was a structural need or solution. Um, but really, it's a large, you know, a large um, room for meeting, for gathering. Um, and the focus is on the Torah and on teaching and studying. So it's a very different arrangement of space than what we'll see in medieval Christian churches. So that image on the left there to show you the pointed arches and roof vault. Here we're looking at the bima, and this is the Torah ark here. So the Torah is behind this curtain, um, and this would be the table for the reader's podium here. And around, like I said, there's an emphasis on study. So there's actually these beautiful wooden chairs and desks that go all the way around. I can go back to the floor plan, but go around the room. And you may have noticed the steps, kind of a bench that went all the way around the synagogue at Deri Ropus, because the understanding is you're going to be here for a while, right? This is a place that um, you can hang out, you stay, you study. The services are going to be, relatively lengthy, so you're going to want to sit down. um, Whereas, in a medieval church, there's no seating. There are no pews in medieval churches. People could mill about a little bit more. Um, the sermons don't get super long until the Reformation. Just kidding. There were some long sermons. Um, and there's definitely no need for desks because most Christians are not literate, right? So this is a very different need in the synagogue where, the men would study together, would discuss texts and doctrines and so on like that, right? Um, and they could also store, books, prayer shawls in these little desks as well. So there's a need, functions also as a kind of little locker of sorts, I suppose. I don't know. But another practical matter, right, is you can see some people there in that photo. Is that everyone is close to the bima and close to the reader, so they're going to be able to hear. So that's slightly elevated, and they're going to be able to hear the Torah portion being read. Um, what else? Yeah, and you can think too, there's such a contrast between what we're going to see in medieval Christian architecture, because here we see an emphasis, like quite literally an embodied emphasis on community, because during the service, everybody's really sitting in a big circle, and so they can see each other, versus in the Christian basilica, where everyone is facing the altar and facing forward. So they're just seeing, there's an emphasis on the clergy, right? Even as there's multiple clergy. So here we have, there's multiple people who would be reading from the Torah, and you'd be seeing people in your community, here, with the exception of women, I should note. Um, so what it seems that in early centuries of Judaism, that women were not permitted to be um, part of synagogue life activity, um, and so they were either, maybe in some cases excluded entirely, or they were in kind of annexes. Like in this instance where we see a little peekaboo peekaboo window into the space where they could still hear the prayers, but they couldn't see the men. The men couldn't see them, right? But as we saw in that original plan, uh, excuse me, this synagogue started as a small uh, space and then was elaborated on and built on as the community grew. So, you know, it's reasonable that like there were more women attending at that time, and maybe some of that space was accommodating for them as well, right? Um, And over time, women were allowed to attend, be incorporated into religious services. Obviously, today there are women rabbis and so on, and we'll talk about that next week. There is a parallel too in that separation of the sexes in church architecture, which I'll try to remember to talk about. And here's just one sample of decoration in the synagogue, which, as you can see, is aniconic compared to the floor-to-ceiling frescoes in the Dura Europa synagogue, but incorporating that pointed arch of Gothic architecture with I don't know, are those like kind of pine coney things? And a beautiful tree. Okay, I'm going to stop there. In class, we'll be looking at some modern examples together, and I look forward to our conversation then.